Hello and good afternoon, all. Welcome to Network 2020's discussion about the global food crisis. This is actually a conversation that we have been wanting to have probably for at least a year or so. So we initially started doing research on a program about food insecurity a year or two ago, mainly in reaction to the pandemic. That was before the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both events throwing millions of people into hunger and food insecurity, and the latter event in particular causing all kinds of ripple effects that really could be felt, I think, for years. Before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to say a few words about Network 2020. So we are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We run a number of different programs, briefings like this. We have private member-only discussions. We do deep dives on topics of interest, and as well as our own research as well. So please do follow us on social media. We put most of our events on YouTube after the fact as well, so you can check us out there. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. So we have Alex de Waal has returned to us. He is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation. And he is also the author of Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine, among other areas of interest and things that he does. And we also have David Laborde, who is the senior research, he is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and he has a focus on globalization, international trade and measurement and modeling of protectionism, among other interests. So thank you very much for being here. Like most of our events, I'm often sorry that we have to have the discussion that we need to, that events have brought us to that point, but here we are. So David, I'd like to start with you. So with the cascading effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and conflict in general, climate change, the pandemic, supply chain issues, how do you untangle the causes of what's happening in the food system today? And what is your assessment of what are the main driving forces right now?
So thanks for this invitation and thanks for the question. It's always difficult to try to disentangle or at least to attribute, a specific responsibility to the different drivers that you have listed, and I will come back to some of them. Now, what is kind of for sure, it's always the last drop that tend to make the cup overfill, but without all the things that have weakened the system before, typically this current crisis will not be as bad. So if we didn't have the pandemic crisis, a number of climate events last year and even at the beginning of this year, the world and the global food system will have absorbed the Ukraine crisis relatively easily. Not perfectly, because there is very specific aspects of this crisis that are quite unique. Last but not least, Russia, by its mere size, is an important player on agricultural markets, but also on input markets, like fertilizer or energy product. And both fertilizer and energy product are key to power the food system globally. So in any case, any disruption with Russia will have consequences. But the kind of gravity of the situation today is, as you have said, it comes on top of these various drivers, and I will just focus on three. So one is already conflict. So maybe they are just national conflict, like in Yemen, like in South Sudan, but they really create an extreme vulnerability. And until last year, even some light famine or pre-famine condition that today, with this crisis, are making things worse. So really conflict, including at the national level or regional level, in the Sahel region or in northern Ethiopia, are really something that weaken local population, local food system. And now, on top of that, you have these two key drivers, I think, that are climate on one hand. We have seen more extreme event and drought in particular in Latin America, that have reduced the supply of soybean that may have an impact on the supply of corn from this part of the world. We have seen typhoon in Southeast Asia impacting plantation in Malaysia. We have a drought in Morocco that will cost the country half of its cereal production, and that basically reduce global production. And for many cases, we are also pointing some countries to depend more on world or regional market this year than others. But all of this has really depleted inventories. The other aspect is the rising energy prices and fertilizer prices that have started last year. That's really a supply driver that increased the cost of production of food. And depending if you are a large farmer or not, sometimes you will have to sacrifice the amount of input you use and your production will be reduced. And maybe on a more optimistic angle, but still an important driver is demand. Also, the amount of food that we need to feed the world today, including in a post-pandemic situation where China decided to rebuild inventories and to buy a lot of basically all commodities, but also including product, has driven price up. So it's always a story about supply, demand, and how different shocks are impacting the system. Now, and really to be more optimistic, I will say, even if we're in a crisis situation today, the overall food system is pretty resilient. We had the pandemic, we have bad weather events, we have a war, we have energy prices, but we don't see 500 million of people in famine. Think about the food system in the 70s when India has this major famine, or in the 80s. We have a problem, but as of today, we are still resilient, but it's still one shock on top of the other.
One follow-up question to that. What makes the food systems resilient? What do you need and what goes into that? If it has been resilient in the past, but now that resiliency might be weakening a little bit, what are the factors that go into resilience?
So one of the key drivers is that we have made still enormous productivity gains in the last 50 years. So we have managed to produce much more. In some places, we are also starting to produce with even less and less resource, even it doesn't look like that, but actually by ton of wheat, even precision agriculture in the US, in Europe, has started to even reduce the amount of fertilizer we need per ton of wheat, so and per hectare. So you see there is these gains that mean that we don't have to rely on more things. Also, we have technology like precision irrigation, that even when there is a bad shock, we are more resilient, and a lot of expenditure in terms of climate adaptation is about also to scaling up this type of solution globally, because what we see also is that not all the farmers are very resilient, depending on your access to this input, this technology, but also access to credit markets, how you can get your finance. That's important. And I mean that today, for instance, that's still a very weak point. Access to finance when you are a small farmers, or where even you are a small and medium-sized enterprises, that's a big bottleneck. That was a crisis issue during COVID-19. That's the situation now. But overall and globally, farmers have access to more finance today than once again 30 years ago. In some cases, microfinance. In some cases, access to future markets. Sometimes people complain about speculation and translation, but that is there's much more tools to manage risk today than in the past. Also, the world is still less poor. We have put out of poverty at least 1 billion people over the last 30 years. So when a shock arrives and you are very poor, then you are going to be in a big trouble. You don't have any buffer. Today, we have managed to do that. And last but not least, and even if it can be a surprise for people, it's because we are in a globalized world, meaning that we diversify risk globally. So when we have a lower supply, let's say, as we have seen in the US, for example, of wheat last year, but we had more wheat coming from Argentina and Australia. Today, of course, normally we rely on Ukraine, but other parts of the world are going to compensate. And really the fact that we have more producers that can enter the game. And that we try also, and I think when you think about agriculture, it's very important to think that we have two hemispheres. So actually we have 4 planting seasons, winter and spring, twice a year. That allow producers to adjust and not just say, oh, we need to wait a full year before someone can start to plant more wheat, because only Europe and the US are in the world market. And so we have to wait their next big winter season to plant. Now we have a much more flexible world. We can react more quickly. And that's what we have seen also during the COVID-19 crisis, a global crisis. In some cases, because it's globalized, we all share the burden, but the capacity to innovate, the capacity to answer it is much more higher today than it was in the past, when each country will try to find an own solution in terms of vaccine on the side. That's a kind of similar in what we see in the food system.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Alex, I'm going to turn to you now with a question that I usually like to start with, which is broader context. So with your historical perspective, can you give us some context on today's food crisis? David referenced a lot of the accomplishments that we've had in the past decades that have resulted in decline in famines and the resilience of the food system. So are the headlines that we're seeing in the news, how accurate are they right now? How concerned are you? And what are the key factors we should be looking for or advocating for solutions?
I think thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be back with you on Network 2020, and thanks also to David for a very comprehensive overview of what is happening to the global food system at the moment. I think we need to distinguish two related but very different phenomena. One is the overall global food system that David has been talking about, which really since the end of World War II has had a general trend, long-term trend towards more efficient production, greater integrated global markets, and a reduction in malnutrition and food insecurity worldwide. It's been a bumpy ride, but it has been mostly in the right direction. And there are a number of questions that arise about the resilience of the system under the stresses of climate change, about its vulnerability because of its extensive reliance on monocropping and so on. But there's another phenomenon, and that's what I want to, another question, which is what I want to focus on, which is the question of famine. Now let's, for the time being, define famine as a very severe outbreak or episode of food insecurity in which 100,000 or more people perish from starvation. Unfortunately, famines are pretty rare. In the book you referenced in the introduction, Mass Starvation, which was published, which was written 5 years ago, published 4 years ago, I chart what happened to famines around the world over the last 150 years. And generally speaking, we've seen a decline. But we've seen about 100 million people perish from famines over that 150 years. Now, what the most important finding actually, though, in the book is that overwhelmingly the cause of famines is not the global food system at all. It is war, it is economic policies like collectivization in China or Soviet Russia, and it is the use of hunger as a weapon of war. Overwhelmingly, something like 3/4 of those who perished in famines since the 19th century have died in famines where the immediate or proximate cause was war, a disastrous economic policy like the Khmer Rouge or North Korea, or deliberate mass starvation, and increasingly so, that almost no famines in the last 50 years for which the primary cause is drought or economic or disruptions in the world economic system. Those that are caused by economic factors are in extraordinarily ill-managed states like North Korea. So it's almost overwhelmingly down to man-made causes. And if we take the 9 cases that the UN has signaled today, there are 9 places around the world where it says there is a medium to high risk of famine. There are 2 in Asia, Afghanistan and Yemen. There are 6 on the African continent. There is Ethiopia, where you have the war in Tigray, which is well, I'll come back to that in a moment. You have Somalia, you have South Sudan, you have Nigeria, the war in the northeast there, you have Congo, and then you have Madagascar. And of these 9, the only one where war is not a major factor is Madagascar, where it is an extreme example of climate change induced drought. That's also a factor in Somalia and southern Ethiopia, but the immediate factors in all the other cases are war. Now, the case of Tigray and northern Ethiopia stands out as a case where you had a location that was the site of a terrible famine that many of us of my generation remember, 1984-85. It was the famine of Bob Geldof's Band-Aid Live Aid. And after that, Ethiopia instituted a whole series of policies to prevent famine from happening again, ranging from the afforestation of degraded hillsides to a poverty safety net program to stop people from dropping out of the system. And that was extraordinarily effective. As of a few years ago, Ethiopia was the world leader in responding to crises caused by drought. And indeed, in 2017, they had the biggest food crisis in the world, and they didn't have a famine, and they didn't have it because they responded very effectively. Now, what has happened in Ethiopia recently is tragic. 2 things: the collapse of that system for political reasons. We don't have a government that cares and has the capacity to do that. It has dismantled that capacity. But more particularly, a very deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war. The destruction of agriculture, the destruction of industry, the destruction of that whole system for resilience, and then the imposition of a starvation siege. We've seen similar things in Syria, in Yemen, in northeast Nigeria, but the worst example is in northern Ethiopia. And it's not as though this is somehow an add-on factor to all the other factors. It's a separate phenomenon. It's something that can only be dealt with politically through making the infliction of starvation morally toxic by outlawing it. It's not something that can be addressed through food policy or agricultural policy. So there are 2 rather distinct things that are going on.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. David, turning back to you, Alex just made, I think, a really good distinction between the general food crisis and countries that are in particular at risk of famine. Taking that away from the famine factor and towards other instability and other hotspots that are caused by the food crisis, what is it that you are looking at? What are the hotspots that you are concerned about? And how do you see governmental policies, as Alex had talked about, playing into where we're going? Because every day I feel like I'm reading a new announcement about a country that is banning exports of palm oil or exports. So where are you particularly focused on right now?
I think all the points made by Alex are critical and very important. So when I'm going to talk about this hotspot, we really have, and as we said, the Tigray region in Ethiopia, South Sudan, Yemen, that are being made vulnerable by, of course, there's some weather shock, but obviously there's a political situation. And I would say, in addition, due to the destruction of their local food system and the vulnerability, they rely much more also on foreign aid and foreign trade. So for Yemen, that's why we are also so concerned that can the World Food Program, for instance, still bring external food to Yemen to continue humanitarian activities. And that's in this context that actually this specific crisis is also a challenge. Because when you are in the WFP and you procure your food from the Black Sea directly or indirectly going through Turkey. I say indirectly because also some of these commodities like wheat or sunflower oil have to be processed. Sometimes they have also to be fortified to increase their nutritional value when you deploy humanitarian response. And due to the war itself and the suspension of maritime transportation in the Black Sea, but also the kind of domino effect coming from the sanctions and also the export restriction coming on top of that, but it is all a kind of cross-fertilization process, you know. Sometimes you do policy response due to answer a shock, it creates even more tension on world markets and so on. We have this problem, but I will still put these countries at war slightly on the side, sorry. Now, with this current crisis, you have a second group of countries that either import a lot directly from the Black Sea region in terms of, in particular, wheat product or sunflower product. And here you see a lot of Arab or Western Asian countries. And depending on their initial vulnerability and current exposure, you have a different story. So you have typically Lebanon. Lebanon is not a country that we're facing major food insecurity until a few years. Now, due to the war in Syria and also political instability in Lebanon, the macroeconomic situation has deteriorated, poverty has exploded, and normally because they purchase a lot of, as I said, of this product to the Black Sea, now they are in a major trouble, their currency has collapsed, and food insecurity is becoming a major issue for it. And of course, if you have rising food prices, and we'll revisit this question, but rising food prices feed also political instability. And then you have a kind of vicious circle at play. On the other spectrum, you have a country like Egypt, that is a major wheat importer, that 80% of its wheat come from either Ukraine or Russia, depending on the year and the month, but has a larger economy, a more diversified economy, has also more friends, I will say. So there is still a very concerned population in Egypt. Keep an eye on the price of bread with a lot of attention. Policymakers are also very concerned about that, but we don't think that a country like Egypt will see famine. There is some adjustment, there is loss of real income, there is potentially a much higher cost for the government to continue to maintain some very large food subsidies. That in the middle of the crisis makes sense, but here also we can really raise the point that a country like Egypt should have done many more reforms before this crisis, because the price of wheat, or at least the price of bread, is totally disconnected from fundamentals, and it leads, for example, to a lot of food waste in Egypt, or also many households in Egypt that benefit from public money to pay for their food should not be targeted by this type of policy. So you know that there is some underlying policy reform that make your country stronger or weaker facing this crisis. But clearly all the Arab world and Western Asia is exposed to this directly due to the link of Black Sea. Then you have a second group of countries that are not directly impacted by the Black Sea distortion per se, but by also the export restriction, as you have said, meaning that countries think that the price go up on world market, they try to keep their food at home. And in itself, it is not a great policy for your neighbor, but in many cases, it doesn't even solve your own problem at home. Meaning that, you know, keeping wheat in India doesn't mean that the people that are already hungry in India will get access to this wheat. So, you know, simple idea in general doesn't work so well on that. But here you have a country like Bangladesh, for instance, that import a lot of vegetable oil, including from Indonesia, also import wheat from both from the Black Sea, but also from other players, including including India. And now they are just exposed due to that, meaning that their traditional suppliers stop to operate on top of this. And then you have the third group of countries that rely on fertilizer. So now we just have, if you have different type of fertilizers, some are what we call the nitrogenous fertilizer, and basically in order to produce them, you can do it if you have natural gas or coal. But then you have also fertilizer like potash, if you don't have a mine of potash, but you need to import it. So it means that for potash, at the world level, 80% of the potash used by farmers have been imported from somewhere. And among this 80%, actually, you have 3 countries that represent 80% of it, that are Belarus, Russia, and Canada. And that's why here you have a specific crisis, but this increase in prices of energy, this increase of prices of fertilizer, some of which are also targeted by export restriction coming from China, for example, on the phosphate sectors, mean that we have a limited amount. We still have fertilizer, but the supply this year will not really match the demand. So some farmers will not have the amount they need. And that is going to impact the food supply everywhere. And that's why we are clearly concerned about how much fertilizer can get Africa, including for their own food security. But we are also thinking about how much fertilizer Brazil will have access to, because Brazil, like other countries in Latin America, contribute to global food security. And last but not least, we have also what's happened on the rice sector. So rice prices today are very or relatively well behaved, so they don't increase. But if you are a farmer producing rice and the price of rice doesn't increase, but the price of fertilizer increase, then you are going to be in trouble. And at one point, rice price can go up, or we can even see a reduction in the supply in many Asian countries. And that would be another big food crisis, because in previous episodes, for example, the rice market was very important to know how many people, in particular, how many poor people are impacted by these dynamics. Because when you look at the world market and you see the price of corn on the world market, actually it's a bad news for the livestock industry globally. So it's much more the meat, dairy sector that care about the global market for corn. The type of corn that people consume in, for example, Africa is of a different type. It's a bit disconnected, but typically wheat and rice are really kind of base staples for at least half of humanity, and even more when you think about the poor households at the global scale.
Great, thank you. Alex, David just did a great overview of how where shocks could be and how that might ripple out. I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit for a moment about the role of price inflation of food in middle income and lower income countries, and just that relationship between those rising prices and how it affects political decisions and political stability. And so what are you looking at on that front?
Well, over the last 50 or more years, there's been a widespread phenomenon in middle income countries of the food riot or the food protest, where you see a sharp increase in the price of basic foods. People often come out on the streets and causes political disruption. And let me give just 2 examples. One was the Arab Spring of 2011, coincided with the second peak of the so-called global food crisis of 2008 to 2011. We came in two peaks, and the second one coincided with uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere. And food, the high price of food was one of the elements that brought people out onto the street. And the second example is very specific. It's Sudan in 2018, when the protesters came out, and their slogan, one of their slogans was "Down with the rule of thieves," and their symbol of the protest was a loaf of bread, saying we cannot afford this loaf of bread. And their accusation was against the government of former President Omar al-Bashir for corruption and for having stolen the money of the country and therefore made bread unaffordable, which was half of the story. There was no doubt the government was profoundly corrupt, and its mismanagement of the economy and its kleptocracy had contributed to making food unaffordable. The other element was outside the government's control, which was a macroeconomic crisis associated with debts, with all the types of disruptions to the world economy over which the government of Sudan had no control or very little control. So that as Russia's war against Ukraine impacted upon global food supplies, countries that were highly reliant on these imports, and David has mentioned many of them, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Bangladesh, and there are many others too, including Sudan for that matter, and Ethiopia. The governments became extremely nervous. They became very nervous that there's a typical rule of thumb among more authoritarian leaning governments, which is if the price increase in staple foods hits 40%, you're in trouble. So governments, with the means, and India and China stand out as governments with a lot of means, will do all they can to conserve their food supplies and keep their food prices under control. Middle countries in the middle, like Egypt, have a lot of clout in the international system to be able to borrow, to be able to turn to wealthy patrons, such as the Gulf countries, in order to get bailouts. Poorer countries, and here Lebanon would be one example, Sudan would be another, are very, very exposed to this. And I think that there will be grave concern that this food price inflation will cause unrest, and it may either overthrow governments, it may lead to governments turning to repressive measures, or it may lead to governments turning to emergency economic measures, which are very costly, borrowing or other measures that increase their dependency on outside donors. So this can have a lot of longer term repercussions for these sorts of states.
Thank you. And before I forget, you both mentioned Lebanon, and I wanted to mention that David has a great blog about the food crisis and its impact on Lebanon. And so Brian, maybe if you wouldn't mind finding that, we could put it in the chat for everybody, please. Thanks. So David, as a member of the UN Global Crisis Response Group, what sort of global response are you seeing to the current crisis? And how are individual governments responding, and are they responding in a way that you think they should be responding? And if not, what can be done about that?
So I will start to say that for the best of the worst, at least there is a global concern on food security. I mean, really, that this crisis has put it on top of the agenda. And from the UN to the G7, to some extent the G20, but also in many countries, this question of food security is important. Now, the food security situation was already deteriorating before this invasion. And unfortunately, it was not so much a concern. And I think that right now, we have clearly a big communication war taking place around this hunger and food insecurity issue, with the Western countries blaming the invasion for creating millions of people of hunger and weakening global food security, and Russia and some of these like-minded countries saying it's the Western sanctions that make things worse, and actually the longer the war lasts, they would not even talk about war, but the bigger the problem is. So everyone has a dialogue and is focusing on food security. Maybe not for the right reason, but at least there is a response. And it also touched the highest executive powers in place. And I have been also part of discussion within the G7. And I can tell you that on a normal year, the food security group of the G7 is not someone that excites a lot of people. And now, that's important. That's go up to both the minister level of development, minister level of agriculture, and the head of states are going to talk about it. And countries like Germany also propose this new global alliance for food security. So just to summarize, a lot of concern, that's good. Some come from the UN, some come from countries, like-minded countries. And the first step is really to do much more information sharing, understanding what's happened. I think that's one of the responses that we are that has been born from the previous crisis in 2007, 2008, and in 2011, when we have seen a number of bad policies implemented because the country doesn't have the right set of information. And so we have seen panic taking place, panic buying by governments, in some cases mimicked by household level behavior when people run to their grocery shop just to start to store rice or store vegetable oil and actually create a shortage when normally we should not have seen a shortage. So this global cooperation around information is important. Now, just to be clear, not all the countries are totally playing fair on that. For example, we still have a number of uncertainties about what are the food stocks of a country like China. As Alex has said before, it's also because it's very politically important for the stability of the country to do it. And when you try to get more information, the answer is basically it's a state security level of information to know how many tons of wheat or corn are in China today. But that plays a very important role about the uncertainty that the market has and that other countries have about is China going to continue to buy or do we have enough? You know, that's what we have to be. So I would just say more cooperation and more information sharing is still the way to go. There are initiatives, but sometimes they are limited. And then, of course, there is a type of export restriction. Everyone say, please do not put them. But at one point, each country has sovereignty on that. And as I said, even if actually these policies can create more damage, even for the country implementing it. So I'm just going to take the example of Argentina. Argentina is a country that used to use this type of instruments. Why they are doing it, of course, they have a problem of political stability for a social reason. But I mean, depending on which government is in power, the relation with the farm sector and the landlord is also tainted by the political history of the country. But for sure, what's happened today is because Argentina is used to do some of these measures, farmers in Argentina are not sure if they should plant more or invest more in the farm sector of their own country. And because they have to pay more in terms of fertilizer, they are just worried that if in 6 months they come with much more wheat, and if the government starts to say, okay, no, but you are going not to sell this wheat because we want to maintain low price at home, they will never recover their cost of production. So these export restrictions that are used in many places, and it's true from Tanzania to India to Argentina. 50 years ago, the US have tried it once, and they have understood why it was not a good idea during the early 70s. But we still see it. It creates damage for other countries, damage for themselves. But really, the political economy of this measure is so particular that there is a lot of effort to even provide more information to government about the own cost for themselves. Because at the end, the fact that they damage other countries or that they create more poverty somewhere else, that doesn't weigh a lot in their own decision. And we can always call for more, yes, cooperation, coordination, so global solidarity. On a practical basis, we don't see it very often. So the last instrument that remains is also basically more money. We need to provide either financial facilities for some countries that need to import food in particular. And so there are initiatives. And so, what will be the role of the IMF, of the World Bank? For some specific countries, potentially they need to require more funding from the G7, because if they go through the IMF or the World Bank today, it will be to take loans. But if you are, as we discussed in Madagascar, in Sri Lanka, potentially Lebanon, making more loans is not really going to help you because you are already heavily indebted. Your currency has collapsed, so making more loans in dollars is not going really to help you. So global solidarity in terms of getting more money, in terms of development support on the short run and then on the medium run for a number of countries is part of the solution. And I think that in the next couple of days with the G7 meeting of the development minister. We are going to see if there is more things. Within the UN, what I would just conclude on that is very different group. What is nice is actually, you know, there are some where the private sectors are very well involved. So in terms of information sharing is important because government doesn't really understand the global food system, I would say. They are not farmers. They don't even understand how you make fertilizers. So you need both farmers, fertilizer company to be part of this dialogue. Logistics also is actually a very important aspect of this type of crisis. If you say we are going to send fertilizer to one place, but you arrive too late in terms of the growing cycle of your plant, you just have wasted efforts. So this type of UN group, bringing together the different actors is useful, but what I see is some countries, by the fact that, you know, the UN represents the whole world and the world today is not totally united about how to deal with this crisis and what should be the answer and who should pay for it. That's where the UN may face some of its limits, but because it represents the complexity and the heterogeneity of views on the question.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box. A lot of good questions coming in, and if you're listening and would like to ask a question, please just put it in the Q&A box and I will try to get to as many of them as possible. So Alex, the first one is for you, and the questioner writes, if you could update your mass starvation book on the history and future after the pandemic, is there anything you would add or change? Has history changed, or did we see more of the same, more of what can predict in terms of government responses in the collapse of our globalized food system?
I think the sad answer is that there isn't much that I would change. My final chapter was what I called the new atrocity famines. And I think what I just didn't foresee was that there would be more of them, or I wasn't able to foresee the specific ones. When I wrote the book, Ethiopia was a success story. It's now a disaster. Afghanistan is also a disaster. But there's one thing I would add, and actually this in many ways picks up on the last point that David was making, which is that there was a brief flurry of attention to the question of armed conflict and food insecurity. In fact, 4 years ago next week, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution 2417, on armed conflict and hunger, unanimously. And what it was trying to do was to put in place a mechanism for responding to these exceptional cases that we've been talking about, where the normal tools of food systems response simply don't work because there is armed conflict. And it's a resolution that specifically calls out the fact that the use of hunger as a weapon of war may be a war crime. And it puts in place a mechanism whereby the UN Secretary General is supposed to report to the Security Council when he is worried, when he has any report or any indication that an armed conflict can lead to food insecurity, or widespread food insecurity is the precise language. And Russia actually voted for this. It voted for it perhaps reluctantly. It said that it wasn't really a political issue. Hunger should be dealt with as a social and economic issue, but it did vote for it. Sadly, this has really not been utilized. And the Secretary General has not stepped up to the plate. He has not put reports in front of the Security Council. Ireland, which is a member of the Security Council, which has its own history of famine, going back to the 1840s, has been very conscientious in bringing cases. But other countries, notably China and Russia, have raised their objections. But I feel that this is still a great missed opportunity for putting that set of issues in front of the international community at the very highest level. And for that reason, I would say, yes, there are new developments, but the outcome, I'm afraid, is pretty much the same as what it was before.
Thank you. David, the next question is for you, and it's sort of a two-part question that takes off after your governmental policies and the need to work together. And so part one is, how can the U.S. supplement the global food supply? And the other question that I'm tacking onto that is, how are US policies vis-a-vis
I can stop to take the first part. Okay, so I think we have a bit of connection issue. So what the US can do and contribute. So of course, there is, I will say three pillars. On one end, yes, contributing to produce more food and to contribute to global market is part of the answer, but I will say, let's be careful here. You know, the last thing we need in the world of today is even relying on more concentration about one or two countries that can have. Because if we just say, okay, the US are going to feed more the world this year and we have a drought during the summer, then the situation is going to be very bad. So I would say let the US farmers do what they are used to do. They may need a bit of support, but actually they are not the farmers in the world that are the most exposed to the crisis. So when we see some kind of generous package for US farmers put on the table by the Biden administration, all the US administration, especially on election year, have been very generous with farmers. So there's kind of tradition here, but actually it's not the more useful way to use US taxpayer money to solve the global food security situation. You can get a much higher return of some of this money by still investing in some low or middle income farming system, even this year, or just to make sure that you will not have a additional famine situation, or just, you know, by supporting some social safety net in some places, instead of starting to grow more soybean in the Midwest and hoping that it will solve situation in the north of Uganda or things like that, you know. So, I mean, producing more food is still good, but, you know, starting to pump taxpayer money to think that we are going to produce more food in the US to solve the situation is an issue. And that will be similarly when we think about food aid. I mean, I still see this tendency to say, okay, if we provide food aid, we are going to do it to use US grains to do that, or we have also specific agreement in the US about, you know, what type of ships. So there is a flag policy about which ships should be used to carry food. In a world in crisis, you really want to be efficient. So you want to make sure that every dollar you spend will deliver the maximum in terms of solving the problems, meaning having a good food supply and bringing food to the people that really need it. But as I said, we are in an election year, so I'm a bit cautious about that. The other aspect is, of course, the biofuel policy of the US. And I think here, in particular in the biodiesel sectors, there is still a tragedy going on, meaning that this year globally, we are going to spend more than 15% of all the vegetable oil produced globally to produce biodiesel. In the US, we are going to reach 47% of all the soybean oil used in the US to produce biodiesel. And if the price of vegetable oils was low, I would say, why not? It means that there's no scarcity. But we are talking about price of vegetable oils today between $1,500 a ton to $1,800. That's 3 times that what we had even 4 years ago. And a lot of this is because from Indonesia to the US, including in the European Union, this first for biofuel, and in particular biodiesel, is so high, then there is a problem. And in itself, I have nothing against biofuel if the markets were allocating the decision, no. But here they are really pushed by policies, they are pushed by mandate. In the US, you even have subsidies to blend biodiesel. And that's even by definition the proof that they are still more expensive than the oil at current prices. So when I see we use more biofuel in order to reduce the cost of living at the pump for the public. That doesn't add up. So I mean, yes, let the farmer do what they do, support them in a way that makes sense, but it's not about thinking that we are going to feed all the world with US farm products. And on the biofuel, if you want to be courageous, yes, there is a decision to be made because after 3 food price crises in the last 15 years, every time through a different angle, so it's not a paste and copy, the drivers are different, but still we have the fact that we use crops and behind crops, land, water, and fertilizer to replace fossil fuel in your cars when the decarbonization of the transportation sector should have taken different forms and would have been even more cost efficient. So.
If I could jump in with one additional point here, which is that for countries facing a food crisis, let's say due to a natural adversity, Madagascar or Malawi, or for crises that are not driven by conflict, we still have a financial system that is positively medieval. It's a bit like beggars lining up outside the church door asking for alms, and they do that, when they have the need, and then the donors come and provide. And it's an extraordinarily inefficient and slow way of meeting the emergency food needs of countries that are facing a food crisis. And given that we are in a world where the number and pace of these crises is increasing, and is it not possible to design a better financial response system in the 21st century? We shouldn't be stuck in this old system of an annual appeal for needs and then knowing that the response is going to be very, very slow. And the World Bank and others have actually explored methods of emergency finance insurance, as it were, so that countries can insure against climatic adversity. And according to their modeling, even with the increased pace and impact of climate-related adversities, it is still much more efficient and cost-efficient to have an insurance-based payment and response system compared to the ad hoc case-by-case. And surely now is the time for putting in place a much more generalized food crisis insurance system around the world.
Thank you for that. And sorry I disappeared and then can't get my camera back on. So apologies for that. And thank you for taking it, running with that. On that point, we did an event, I don't know, probably about a year ago with the UN Capital Development Fund about insurance schemes for the least developed countries, specifically to mitigate against climate change. And just that idea, I think, of getting ahead of problems, I think is fascinating. So again, Brian, I don't know if you have time, but if you're able to find it and put it in the chat, please do. The next question is whether the crisis in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, is diverting resources away from places like Afghanistan and others. So Alex, maybe I'll direct that to you first, and then David, if you have any comments, please follow up.
Well, I think there are 2 points to make here. One is that the crisis has pushed up the cost of response. I mean, the World Food Programme reports that its operating expenses have increased by 44% over the last 12 months. And that's because of increases in food and fuel prices. The other is, I'm just looking at a chart of the global inequalities in humanitarian response. And the differences in levels of response are very striking. So Ukraine, the initial appeal for 1.1 billion was fully funded. The updated appeal to 2.25 billion has more than 60% met. Compare that with Afghanistan, 18%, Yemen, 21%, South Sudan, 21%, Nigeria, 14%, Somalia, 8%. So the Ukraine needs the resources, there's no question, but and up to now, the resources going to Ukraine are not such that they have on a humanitarian scale, that is, the humanitarian resources have not been a major drain on the overall basket. But there's no doubt that the prioritization of Ukraine is leading, unfortunately, to a deprioritization of other crises, and I fear that this sort of scissors effect of the increased cost of response and the prioritization of Ukraine is going to leave the rest of the world shortchanged.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I'd like to end with a question for both of you. And it's, is there anything specific being overlooked about the food crisis that people, and more importantly, the media, need to be paying much more attention to? And so David, I'll start with you on that.
So, and I will bridge with what has just been said. I think first, even due to climate change, we are going to see more shock to the system. So how we make it more resilient, and including this question of managing risk globally, and the question of safety net for households, but also for countries with this innovation in terms of financial solution that Alex has talked about, is really something to keep in mind in the current evolution of the situation. Now, for the crisis, so me, I start to raise the flag on what's coming since end of January this year, because it was clear that the conflict will go on, will start, and that food security will be a key thing. During the month of February, honestly, on food security aspect, even the development community was not really interesting. The only people interested by the story was the military staff or the military people, because they know that also when food security is concerned, you can start to see domino effect. Then after the first week of the invasion, everyone was talking about wheat. It's a wheat problem, it's a wheat problem. No, it's not just the wheat problems. We have other commodities. Think about the vegetable oil. And then it's a fertilizer. So what I see is still a lack of, projecting people's mind to what is the next problems, or how a systemic problem can occur. Now, I think that the overall media coverage I start to discuss about all of that, the fertilizer, and there's actually a lot of good media places that connect the dots. And really linked to what Alex has said before, I think what will be the global response, and including in terms of foreign aid, that we are going to see in the next 2 years. And it's maybe the most important thing, that will not just focus on the current crisis and the humanitarian response, but invest in more medium-term and long-term investment plan to do a lot of the investment that are needed to make the world more resilient, and that a large part is going to also make African agriculture more productive, more modern, in order to have, like Latin America start to play an important role in terms of global food security in the last 20 years or 30 years. We want to see the same thing in Africa. So really making sure that we are leaving this crisis with a strategy to not just try to stop the fire when the house is already on fire, but to really pay for a better fire detection system, but also a fire extinguishing system.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thanks. And what about you, Alex?
I've just one quick point to make, which is that we talk about man-made famine, and the gendered language is correct. There are no women-made famines, but it is women and children who are the ones who suffer overwhelmingly in these famines.
And a very sobering point to end on. So thank you both very much for the work that you do, and for joining us today. It was truly a privilege to talk to both of you. And I appreciate everyone who joined as well and for all the fantastic questions. So thank you. Our next briefing is next week on Monday, and it's a bit tongue-in-cheek of a title, but will big tech take over the role of nation states? So a slightly different topic, but I hope that you can join us. So thank you, David. Thank you, Alex, very much. It was a real pleasure. So have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.